Hi, this is Dr. Sana Hashmi, and this week in my Print on China column, I explored the Chinese discourse on the protest in Iran. So I explored what the Chinese are talking about, the implications of the protests, the unrest in Iran on Chinese interest, as well as the implications of US actions and interest in Iran with respect to China. So, of course, this is a global news now. The year started with Venezuela, and now we are talking about Iran. So, of course, Iran is in closer proximity to China, and China has a lot of interest with respect to Iran, be it in its infrastructure projects or the oil imports from the Middle East. So, across Iran, protests are sweeping through more than half of the country, and people are demonstrating against soaring inflation, a collapsing currency, and economic hardship. And from China's perspective, these protests are serious, but in their opinion, it is not threatening to the regime. So there's not going to be a regime change, and there is consensus about this argument on the Chinese internet. And Chinese analysts describe these protest unrest as fragmented, decentralized, and more localized, and in contrast to what the Western media is depicting. And they believe that this is unlikely to topple the government. China is also watching the international dimension. The recent 25% US tariff that was announced by the US President Donald Trump on Truth Social just 2 days ago on Iran's trading partners is seen as economic coercion and political signaling. Um, in Chinese view, this is targeted at China. Given China's position as Iran's largest trading partner, the message is directed at Beijing and not at any other country. This is what the Chinese are saying. And some commentators describe this as cognitive warfare on the part of the US, which is aimed at generating pressure and strategic uncertainty in Tehran. Then, by extension, this will also be having strategic uncertainty on Beijing. And this is primarily because China's position as Iran's one of the most important partners, both in strategic as well as economic terms. So, China views US and Israeli actions as carefully calibrated. The goal, according to Chinese analysts, is to weaken Iran without triggering full scale conflict. Targeted pressure may unsettle Iranian leadership, but in Chinese view, escalation could provoke a broader Iranian response, especially due to Tehran's control over oil exports. And these views reflect a wider Chinese tendency to emphasize regime resilience and caution against overstating the impact of what they are calling a street mobilization and nothing more than street mobilization in Iran. But apart from their views on what is actually happening, the protest and the US hand behind it, the economic stakes for China are high. And Chinese investment in Venezuelan oil and Iranian oil are something that have got a lot of attention on the Chinese internet. In fact, there was one post that said that the Chinese investment in both Venezuela as well as Iran are about to be robbed by American robbers, and this would put trillions in investment at risk. And in fact, much more than Venezuela, Iran poses a greater risk for China. Iran supplies nearly 15% of China's oil imports, and almost half of its total crude oil import comes from the Middle East. And in fact, this 15% makes up 90% of Iran crude oil import. So it's Iran is heavily dependent on China for its oil exports, as well as China is dependent on Iran for getting its oil imports. So this means that disruptions in Iran through unrest, strikes, or threats to the Strait of Hormuz, it could all push oil prices by 15 to 20 US dollars per barrel. So this is going to have a huge impact on the oil purchases for China from Iran. But that's not it. China's Belt and Road Initiative is also at risk. Railways, pipelines, and ports in Iran could also be impacted, threatening long term infrastructure and investment projects. And in fact, there are a number of Chinese commentators who are using vivid metaphors. And I would quote one analyst who described Iran as a VIP private room within the Belt and Road Initiative, a place where energy and infrastructure cooperation is heating up like a simmering stove. And for Beijing, the question is now about should Beijing try to act as a peacemaker or should solely focus on protecting its economic as well as strategic energy interest. But then China is also focused on the regional dynamics. China is also watching India's influence in Iran, and many in China are talking about Tehran continuous support for India's investment in Iran and engagement with India, and how Tehran continues to lease Chabahar port to India, even as the China backed Gwadar port, China Pakistan economic corridor develops nearby. And they are talking about India's renewed 370 million investment at Chabahar port, which, according to the Chinese view, showed the limits of China's leverage, despite close ties under the 25-year comprehensive cooperation agreement between China and Iran. So they're also placing the blame on Iran here and trying to portray that despite China's continuous effort towards Iran, be it in the investment sector, be it the deal between Iran and Saudi, oil imports, economic incentives, economic cooperation, Iran had always leaned towards India and played its cards foolishly. So the idea is that they should have just been in the China camp so that China would have more reasons and rationale to perhaps engage with Iran when there are unrest going on and when the US is totally against Iran. So many are saying that China doesn't really have a lot of reasons to openly support Iran right now. So within this framing, within this context, China's approach to Iran's unrest, many are saying should be cautious and calculated. Beijing should first wait and watch how the situation pans out before actually going out in full support for Iran. Now, Beijing seeks to safeguard energy security, protects its investment, and navigate regional competition. It wants to avoid becoming entangled in conflict that could disrupt its strategic objectives. And then Iran's turmoil is a delicate balancing act as of now. Every move carries strategic, economic, and geopolitical consequences for China. And for Beijing, the challenge is how to maintain stability, secure energy, and manage influence, all while keeping a careful eye on the actions of the US, India, and other regional players. So, for now, global energy, regional influence, and strategic signaling. This is how China reads the unrest in Iran. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week.